It is July 15th, 1779 at 8 p.m. You are a Continental soldier getting ready to embark and to attack the fortifications at Stony Point. Everything has been in silence. You are made up to look pretty, in a sense, but you've just been given orders that if you fall out of line while on this march, and you are told, if you're part of the flanking movements or the pincer movement, you are not to have your musket or your firearm loaded. But if you fall out of line, you will be killed with no questions asked for the integrity of the mission. Leading this is General Anthony Wayne, or as they would say, General Mad Anthony Wayne. And he is to bring a few regiments with him, attacking Stony Point, held by, now roughly at the time, 500 to 600 British soldiers. And they are unaware of their coming. And that's where we are at today, Stony Point Battlefield. Now the question is, why do the British control Stony Point along the Hudson River? Well, it's an effort of George Washington to come back here after the 1778 campaign with Monmouth and everything. But he comes back and they take over Stony Point. But they are knocked off by the British because he's trying to protect West Point, which is not too far north from here, along the Hudson River. And infamously, a year later, Benedict Arnold will become known as a traitor. But for now, Stony Point is just one of the launch points that the British can use to attack West Point. The Hudson River is still very much a, critical waterway, and the British are still trying to gain control of it. And the British are also still trying to defeat George Washington. He's narrowly escaped a lot of battles, but now the Continental Army is quite the professional force after their time at Valley Forge. And so, to devise a plan to take over and to defeat the British and recapture Stony Point, General Washington has gave the order to General Anthony Wayne to take control of this fortification area. It's one of the tightest parts of the bend of the Hudson River, and it's more or less like a chokehold. If you can control it, you can pretty much just be able to control the Hudson a little bit north of New York City, and that's its strategic advantage. Stony Point and West Point, they're both strategical in being able to hold the Hudson. And that is why the British took it over, and that's why the Americans have to come and retake it back. And in this episode, we're going to talk about what actually happened here at this really quick, brief attack and storming of the fortifications at Stony Point. Now, as I walk along these grounds of Stony Point, I am faced with a whole lot of rising and lowering terrain with a lot of rocks, more or less boulders too. But it looks still pretty much the same from when the little fight happened. So what we're seeing is what the soldiers had to face off against the British. Now, it was split 3 ways. It had to be split like a pincer movement. You had a frontal assault, which was more or less a feint of roughly 150 muskets. And then you had a force coming along the northern end of fortification to, the force of 300 coming through the northern end part. And then you had a force of 700 coming along the southern part. The 700 part was commanded by Anthony Wayne. And they were not allowed, those 1,000 men were not allowed to have their muskets loaded or their weapons loaded for the sake of being safe and carrying out the assault. They only had their bayonets fixed. And the code word for was taking the fort is, the fort is ours. And there were many parts of abattis surrounding this area. Now I'm going to cut to what I've been walking right now. See, from down here, this is where I've walked down to that point. And I've walked up to this point. And there's still plenty more to go. But this is all inside the fortifications. These rocks were here at the time of the battle. You can see some of the Hudson there. You can see some of the Hudson through those trees there. So the blockhouse, the old blockhouse, is where we're walking to. And as you can see here, how the terrain is nothing but rocks, hills, not even hills. It's just, this would be a soldier's nightmare to climb. So to get up there, and to get up here is very daring. And as you can see how far down that drops, that is steep. And that lighthouse you see here coming up, that's where the blockhouse was. This is the northern side where the 300 men stormed up. And if you can see where those trees are, that's how steep they had to come up here to get. And they did so quietly. See, that's a good portion right there of just how steep it is. And this is just coming around where that structure is up top. Here we come upon where the lighthouse is that used to work. It's been there for 200 years now. Getting ready to, I was told. But this is more or less the terrain that the Continentals faced. As you can see here, it sweeps up And we get to this lighthouse where the blockhouse once stood. It was actually built on top of the grounds of the blockhouse. And this is the area where Anthony Wayne assaulted. Now, for the most part, they were in the water to get here, while the 300 men were able to come around the one side of the abattis and find their way. And make their way up here. This is very compact, of just nothing but rolling hills and everything as such, and rocks, anything that can get in your way to stymie an assault. And there's the Hudson right there. And heading that way, that's towards New York City. Meanwhile, in that direction, up the Hudson, is West Point. Up that way. Right across there would be a fort too, to help with the attack and to help with assaulting, not the assaulting, but that was actually eventually taken over by the British. But when the Continentals took over Stony Point, they aimed the cannon and artillery over there, and they surrendered as well and took over. But it was help as a chokehold and a choking point for any ships that came up the Hudson, which is what we see here. I have to say that is quite a beautiful view. So I have with me here a couple books. One being this one, A Guide to the Battles of the American Revolution by Theodore P. Savas and J. David Dameron. I also have A Battlefield Atlas of the American Revolution by Craig L. Symonds. And recently, a book I read just right before I came here, Stony Point Battlefield, American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, a sketch of its revolutionary history, and particularly of the surprise of Stony Point. So I'll be reading those books today for context of what happened here at Stony Point. So with the American Revolution, A Guide to the Battles of the American Revolution by Theodore P. Savas and J. David Dameron, it gives here the British perspective for the Stony Point. So on page 217 it says, during the summer of 1779, the northern theater of war was grounded in a stalemate, the major fighting having shifted into the southern colonies. To protect the main British garrison stationed in New York City and dissuade Washington from moving his army down the Hudson River from his encampment at West Point, General Sir Henry Clinton established and maintained an outer network of defenses. An integral part of this defensive network included several strongholds along the river. Two of the strongest were at Stony Point, 24 miles north of New York City, on a spit of land jutting out from the western side of the river, and the Fort Lafayette on Verplank's Point directly across the Hudson on the eastern shore. And British warships patrolled the Hudson with the sloop of war Vulture stationed between these two strategic river posts. And Stony Point was garrisoned by 625 soldiers, 17th Regiment, one company of 71st Highlander Grenadiers, Tories from the Loyal Americans, and 15 field pieces, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson. Its defenses consisted of two landslide lines, inner, upper, and outer, lower, and outposts protected by obstructions that made an approach from the west over the cleared terrain difficult. The longer outer line, designed to defend the western approaches and cover the ground south toward Haverstraw Bay, was swept by 6 field pieces and 300 men. Now for the American perspective. Once the British changed from an offensive to defensive strategy in the Northern Theater in 1778, the war in New England sputtered into a fitful standstill. General Washington knew a major offensive against the powerful enemy in New York City was out of the question. He also knew it was unlikely General Clinton would conduct a serious aggressive campaign against his army in upstate New York at West Point. With large-scale operations off the table, Washington searched for ways to harass and injure the enemy on a smaller scale. A minor British thrust partway up the Hudson River offered Washington an opportunity to embarrass his opponent. So in late May and early June, a British expedition moved upriver to Stony Point and Verplank's Point, just a dozen miles below West Point. The Narrows at that point comprised King's Ferry, a major Hudson crossing point and communications link for the Patriots that also provided access to the Hudson Highlands. The forts on both points were unfinished and fell easily. When it became obvious West Point was not under a threat of attack and that Clinton was working to reinforce and strengthen the captured forts, Washington decided to send General Mad Anthony Wayne and his 1,200-man brigade to capture Stony Point. Based upon intelligence and first-hand observation, Washington ordered his subordinate to use a night assault to overwhelm the bastion. So we have from The Guide to the Battles of the American Revolution by Theodore P. Savas and J. David Dameron, the reason behind the assault for Stony Point. Now here I have a battlefield atlas of the American Revolution by Craig L. Symonds. And on page 69 it gives a brief summary of Stony Point. The British and American armies around New York remained largely immobile for the rest of the 1778 and into the spring of 1779. Then, in an attempt to draw Washington into a general engagement, Clinton, on the last day of May in 1779, seized the American outpost of Stony Point, which commanded King's Ferry across the Hudson River, an important link between American forces in New York and New England. The British garrison left behind to occupy Stony Point, some 600 men under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson, called their fortress a Little Gibraltar, which I can kind of understand the way it is seen as, I can tell. And indeed, it did resemble a miniature version of the Rock. Surrounded by water on 3 sides and separated from the mainland by low ground that flooded at high tide, it rose 150 feet above the Hudson to a flat rocky crest, which the British stripped of trees and fortified with a series of redoubts. A narrow causeway connected it to the western shore, but at high tide, even this was under 2 feet of water. So that is true. Stony Point is mainly an island. It's been filled in. The entrance is mainly like marshy to getting here, but that's been deduced to a train track where trains can go through. But in that area, it was swampy, marshy. So more or less, Stony Point itself is just an island that gets cut off every time there's a high tide. Washington at first reacted to the British initiative at Stony Point with resignation. All we can do is to lament what we cannot remedy, he wrote. But after more reflection, he determined to employ the newly reorganized Light Infantry Brigade of Brigadier General Anthony Wayne in a secret and daring attack to regain the post. Wayne was somewhat dismayed after his initial reconnaissance of Stony Point, but told Washington that he would assault hell itself if Washington ordered it. So Wayne's brigade began its stealthy advance just before midnight on July 15th. The right-hand column had to wade through waist-deep water at the southern end of the swamp, and the sound of hundreds of men sloshing through the muck alerted a British picket who sounded the alarm. The British opened fire from the heights, but the Americans splashed ahead and gained firmer ground. The forlorn hope raced ahead, and the axemen went to work. Unable to return fire, the Americans clambered up the rocky slope and into the British works, the right column only minutes ahead of the left. In 30 minutes it was over. In a wild melee, the British garrison was overwhelmed and forced to surrender. The British lost 63 killed, 70 wounded, and over 500 captured. The Americans lost only 15 killed and 80 wounded, including Wayne, who suffered a head wound but remained in command. It was a small victory, especially in the light of the fact that the Americans abandoned the post 2 days later. But it was also an important victory because it infused a new vigor into American hopes and demonstrated once again the increased professionalism of the Continental troops. So here I have Stony Point Battlefield, American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society book, as you can see here. And on page 32, it gives a description of what took place. The 4th Regiment in Wayne's organization was that of Colonel Rufus Putnam of Massachusetts. His battalion, 4 Massachusetts companies, was commanded by Major William Hull of Massachusetts, and his second, 2 North Carolina and 2 Massachusetts companies by Major Hardy Murphy of North Carolina. At this time, however, it was only partially organized, and Major Hull's command in the battle was a detachment of about 300 men assigned to him for the occasion. Light Horse Harry Lee had been ordered to follow the expedition with a reserve corps. A regiment under Colonel Ball was moved forward from Rose's Farm for additional support, and General Muhlenberg's brigade had been maneuvered into the vicinity by Washington upon some pretext as a cover for the whole. Wayne's own troops took an unfrequented back road behind Bear Mountain and about 8 p.m. halted at Spring Steele's farm, about a mile and a half west of Stony Point. Here, while the troops were resting, Wayne and other officers made another careful examination of the ground that they were to cover. Wayne also took time to write a farewell letter to his brother-in-law, Sharp Delaney, committing his wife and little son and daughter to Mr. Delaney's consolation and care. At length, the order of battle was read to the troops, and then they knew the bloody work for which they were destined. The watchword was given, and pieces of white paper were fixed in their hats. At 11:30 p.m., the order to march was given, and with the silence of a phantom army, the 2 columns started for the assault. The right column was headed by a forlorn hope of 20 men under Lieutenant Knox. Next came the remainder of the van, 130 men under Lieutenant Fleury. Then, with General Wayne, came the regiments of Febiger and Meigs and the detachment of Hull. The left column was led by another forlorn hope of 20 men under Lieutenant Gibbon. Next came the remainder of the van, 80 men under Major Stewart, and then Butler's regiment, followed by Major Murphy's companies. While the Americans stealthily approached, the British garrison was sleeping quietly in the fancied security of the Royal Artillery, the 17th Foot, the 71st Grenadiers, and the loyal Americans, all under the command of Lieutenant Henry Johnson of the 17th. Perched in their craggy fortress like eagles in their nest, protected on 2 sides by the Hudson River, in which the British gunboats rode at anchor, and on the inside shore by a dangerous morass crossed by only a narrow causeway. The position of the British was well nigh impregnable. Their works on the heights contained 15 pieces of artillery, ranging in caliber from an 8-inch howitzer down to 12-pounders, and were protected on the western slope by 2 rows of abattis, reaching from the river on the north to the river on the south. In the absence of the diagram referred to in Wayne's order battle, a rough sketch in President Styles' diary in the Yale University Library, and a plan of the surprise of Stony Point drawn by the British engineers and published by William Fadden, the King's Geographer, in 1784 are generally accepted as approximately correct in showing the routes taken by Wayne's troops when they invaded the peninsula. The Americans reached the peninsula and began the assault at about 12:30 a.m. on July 16th, 1779. Wayne's right column is supposed to have made a wide detour to the southeast from Springsteel's, striking the beach south of Stony Point, wading across southern mouth of the marsh, reaching up the upland of the peninsula just west of the first line of abattis, and fighting its way up the southern side of the slope. Butler's column is thought to have waded across the northern end of the marsh and skirted the northern end of the peninsula. Murphy is commonly conceded to have broken off from Butler's rear and crossed the mud bridge midway between the right and left arms and left columns to amuse the enemy in the center. It was roughly about 150 so. Murphy's men were the only ones permitted to load their guns, and as soon as the firing from the British apprised him that Wayne's approach was discovered, he began a noisy demonstration in the center to give the impression that he was making the main attack. Meanwhile, the right and left columns, still without loading, were picking their way up the precipitous rocks like mountain goats, fighting only with the bayonet. The British were soon astounded to find the Americans right under their noses on two sides of their works. In their desperation, they poured down a frightful fire from heavy guns and small arms at the attacking parties, whom they could but dimly see, and whose numbers they had no means of ascertaining. The surprise and terror of the British could not have been greater if the rocks had opened and 1,000 crews of Henry Hudson's men had appeared in the midst of them. But they had no vapory ghosts to contend with, and Wayne's men, plunging into an inferno of grape shot and musketry and pressing steadily upward, tore their way through the double line of abattis, passed to the breastworks, cut away the pickets, cleared a chevaux de frise out of a sally port, mounted the parapet, and entered the fort at the point of the bayonet, shouting by prearrangement, "The fort's our own!" Almost immediately the left column entered from the other side, and triumph was complete. And during the assault, Wayne was wounded in the head, but struggling to his knees, cried out, "March on! Carry me into the fort! Let me die at the head of my column!" Wayne's wound, however, proved to be a slight one, and he lived many years to add to an already glorious career. The total loss of Americans was 15 killed, 83 wounded. The British placed their losses at 20 killed, 132 wounded and missing. Wayne, however, reported that he had killed 63, wounded 61, and captured 575 prisoners. Only one of the British garrison escaped. Upon securing possession of the fort, the Americans turned the guns on Verplancks Point, but without effect. The British ships discreetly slipped their cables and dropped down the stream. And the day after the capture, Washington came to Stony Point with Generals Greene, Steuben, and others, just to pretty much see what took place. Now, as I walk up down this steep bit of hill behind me where that structure is, that was quite a hike, even from a even from a short distance. As you can see behind me, there it is already, and there's the rolling slope. That's actually pretty steep. That would be probably fun for sledding if you don't hit any of the rocks, but I can only imagine trying to storm up this kind of stuff with an army. Not even an army, just storming up and trying to fight your way up, so just so you can achieve victory for your general. And even here you have some difficulty with the terrain. This kind of reminds me also of a very compact Plains of Abraham up in Quebec. If you remember that video, there's just a whole bunch of rolling hills just crammed together, but this is more than that. But the view here is spectacular. I'm right across the river. I'm looking at Verplancks Point, where the other fort was. I can't help but look down from where I'm standing and imagining, oh, there's a firing of the gun. It must be 3 o'clock. But I can't help but imagining just how daunting it would be to storm up this part of the island, or even on the other side of the island, just in general. But it was done, it was achieved, and this midnight raid was one that Anthony Wayne can take pride in, because he was ambushed at Paoli right after Brandywine in 1777. This was his giving back the British their comeuppance for that assault, for that massacre. And when I look at the way the battle was fought, this assault was fought, it kind of reminds me of Benedict Arnold and General Montgomery's assault at Quebec too, where they try to have a pincer movement come around the sides of the city or the town at the time and have a force in front, kind of giving the illusion that that's the main assault, especially during a snowstorm. Now, what I heard here was the weather was perfectly on the American side. The wind was howling. You couldn't hear anything. So everything was just late. And it was beautiful but windy. So the muskets would work when they needed to be fired, you know, and just all in all, the spectacular victory of this position was short. It took 25 minutes. That's a heavy 25 minutes in my opinion, because if they left at 11:30, they started the assault at 12:30. That's already, so once they started the march at 11:30, they would be done by 1 o'clock in the morning, and everybody surrendered. Once they get the assault, they're already like, all right, we're good. We just kicked butt and do what we had to do with so little losses. Now, sadly, the Benedict Arnold General Montgomery didn't go as well, but this is like a textbook thing of what that was supposed to be like from what I remember. So, but with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.